This is my 2001 2.5 V6 Petrol Manual Jaguar X Type. I've now had this for 5 years. The other day I was doing the standard oil and water checks under the bonnet when my 15-year-old daughter came out and asked me to point out some of the engine components. And I could do the usual thing of saying, well, the water goes in there, the brake fluid goes in there, the battery's under there, the fuses are in there, the air filter is in there, the oil goes in there, and you check the oil there, the windscreen washer water goes in there, that's part of the braking system, the power steering oil goes in there. And then she went, okay, what's that bit? And I was thinking, actually, I don't know what half the things are on this engine. So this video is about looking at the various components on this engine and just giving them a name. I've just taken off the plastic cover so it's easier to see where the parts are. And we'll look at this by system, and we'll start with the air system. So the air is sucked in through the twin air intake, which actually converges into the air box. So this is the air box, inside that is the air filter. I hardly ever change the air filter, we live in a reasonably clean environment. And the air filter then passes the air down into the main manifold. On the way it goes past this box, which is called the resonator box, and supposedly that's to reduce noise and to stabilise the airflow. Then goes in through this manifold, and it needs to be flexible because obviously you've got movement in the engine. As the air comes into the manifold, it goes past this sensor. This is the mass airflow sensor. Effectively that's a temperature gauge that the faster that the air goes in, the colder the temperature, and that sends a pulse to the computer saying how fast the air is going into the engine. Here we have the throttle body, so effectively the old carburettor, and on the outside we've got the actuator, and that is what actually turns the valve that's inside it. And on the other side is a sensor, which is the position sensor, telling the computer where the throttle body actually is. On top we have two pipes. These are the vacuum takeoff for the brakes, and this is the brake vacuum chamber. So they're not actually part of the induction, but they use the air pressure to control the brake power. On top of the engine we have here a ventilation pipe, and at the end of it, just here, is the PCV valve, the positive crankcase ventilation valve, and basically that's just letting the engine breathe into the manifold rather than into the atmosphere. The air manifold divides into two. The top half goes into the bank at the front of the car, so that's 3 cylinders at the front, and the other half goes down into the rear bank. These two actuators on the end are actually fine-tuning vanes, and these are solenoid controlled motors, again with a valve inside which controls the rate of the airflow. So in the old days when you had a carburettor, then you just opened and closed the carb. This now opens and closes and then thinks about it some more and open closes again, and you can see the electronic controls. They are connected to the electronic control module, which on these cars is hidden down there, and you can just see it down there, and that controls virtually everything. On the top at the back here is the manifold air pressure sensor, and that tells the difference between the pressure in the manifold and the pressure in the atmosphere, and then the computer can take into account how to control the air going into two halves of the manifold. Right, moving away from the air system, we'll look at the braking system. So we have here the vacuum servo, and the vacuum, as I've said, is run off those two pipes. They're apparently quite fragile and tend to leak, so that's not good for your brakes. Then you have the brake master cylinder with its reservoir on the top, and this is a sender to tell you that it's getting too low. If that comes on, you're in a lot of trouble actually. Now on my car, that has had a new brake master cylinder, and you can always tell when it's had one because there's a burn mark where the old fluid came out, and in my case I have painted that over because it looked pretty rank. Now, a long tube comes all the way around the car, all the way down here and all the way down here, and this is the ABS brake modulator. And this unit, controlled by the electronic brain, makes sure that you don't lock up your wheels and skid down the road. It's the thing that actually makes your brakes pulse. Now another pipe comes out of the brake master cylinder, and that goes down into the bottom of the car and down there, and you can just about see the top of where the clutch master cylinder is, and that's hidden in the top of the gearbox. So you can imagine that's a real bugger to change that. Looking now at the coolant system, this is the expansion tank, and this is where you actually fill the car up. Now it should be full to that point there where it says max. Mine is a little bit low, which is a worry, and I've noticed that on here there's a little bit of white crusting. That means it's actually leaking out. I need to take that out and clean that up properly. The pipes go off. There's a T-piece here. This T-piece is famous for failing, and that branches off into the heater matrix inside the car, and then the pipes go across. This part then goes into the water pump, and the water pump is just down here, and that's driven off this belt off the end of the engine block. The top of the car, join together and come back to the main pipe, or the main hose I guess. That goes all the way back here, and in there is a T-piece, and in the T-piece, which you can't actually see from here, is the thermostat. Another thermostat is this electronic one, and this controls the fans. Actual signal for the water temperature comes from this point here, so you would hope that this point here was the same temperature as the thermostat, which is hidden under there and really hard to get at. Just out of interest, this is what a thermostat looks like. This is not actually out of my Jag, it's out of my motorbike, but they all look pretty much the same. The way to test it is to put it on a wire and put it in a glass of boiling water from the kettle, so that you can see that it actually moves and actuates. So if we look at the way that the engine is timed, these are very sophisticated engines and have variable valve timing, and the way that works is, if you look in here, you can see a timing chain, and the timing chain runs around a thing called a phaser, and the phaser is an oil-filled clutch, and the oil-filled clutch can vary the position of the cam in relation to the position of the crank at the bottom. And the way it does that is by using a position solenoid which alters the oil flow, and there is two, one for each side, and then on the end of each bank there is a cam position sensor, which is that little black plastic thing, and that tells the computer where the cam is in relation to the crankshaft in the bottom of the engine. Incredibly clever piece of kit, apparently invented by Fiat. You see them on a lot of engines. The idea is that it can sense how much fuel the actual engine needs and varies the position of the camshaft, so you get better fuel economy and more power. This car does 30 to the gallon under most circumstances. I can get 35 on the motorway if it's a really long 100-mile plus journey. So I suppose, you know, it does work. Extremely complicated and needs a computer to run it. Just here we have a coil on the top of a spark plug, and there are 3 on this side, the other 2 are under the filter, and there are 3 in the back of the car where you can't possibly get at them without taking off the manifold. So when you want to change your plugs, you also have to take off all of that big chunk of aluminium and replace all of the gaskets that come with it. So fortunately you don't have to do it more than sort of once every 100,000 miles. The old days when you had a distributor, one coil and a set of plugs are long gone. You've now got 6 plugs, 6 coils, and then obviously the whole system that operates the fuel injection. Now this is the fuel injection rail coming in here. This little point here is where you test the fuel pressure, and when my car broke down and the AA man came, he took that off and he pushed it and a load of fuel squirted out all over the engine. But that was proving that my system was pressurised. Also proved that my fuel pump wasn't working. There are 2 connectors here and they're just held on the metalwork of the battery tray. The grey one is for the gas oxygen sensor, and that goes off down there, down the bottom of the car. So we're looking at the top of the fan shroud, and in the distance there's a shiny cable, and that's where the actual sensor is. So in order to get at that one you have to take all of the air filter off, and then you need a special tool to remove it. And even though I bought this special tool, I was unable to do that, and it had to go down to the garage. The rear one is buried down there at the back of the engine somewhere, and I can just about see where it is, and again that's a real devil to change. Those sensors are about 85 quid each, and what they're for is to actually control the mixture that goes out of the exhaust and down into the catalytic converter. So looking down into the bowels of the engine, this is the engine mount that goes onto the gearbox, and incidentally this is where you should put your black lead if you have to jump start the car. Looking across over the water pipes, the infamous T-piece, can see the top of the starter motor, so there's the solenoid and the starter motors underneath it. Quite tucked away, but apparently you can change that without taking everything out. And below that, I'm not sure we're actually going to be able to see it that easily, but below that, that actuator with the red clip on it, that is the gearbox actuator, and there are 2 of those and they are cable operated. So that's the top one, the bottom one you can't see from up here. The air conditioning radiator, normally called a condenser, is in the front of the car, and also below it is an oil cooler, and the oil cooler runs round to where the oil filter is, which you can't see from above, you can only see it from below, and just above the oil filter is where the temperature gauge and the oil pressure gauge are. As part of the air conditioning system, the air conditioning pump is right down there at the bottom, and unfortunately it's beneath the alternator, so if your alternator goes you have to take the air conditioning pump off as well, which is another really brilliant piece of design. Also buried somewhere down there must be the power steering pump. The power steering reservoir is up here. You need to look at that every 6 months just to make sure you haven't lost any oil, but I would have thought if you've lost some oil it would be on your drive. There's plenty of electrics under the bonnet. This huge loom here comes from the other fuse box, which is in the glove box, and then you've got this fuse box here which is full of fuses and relays, and in the top of the box itself they give you extra fuses and the little extraction tool, which makes it very much easier to get those bits out. You actually need to keep your book in the car if you want to know what they all do, because it is not written on there anywhere. You actually have to have a diagram. The battery, pretty standard battery. This battery wasn't new when it came with the car, and it's easily done 5 years and it's been very good, so no complaints about that. Looking down the front of the car you can see that in there are where the headlights are and the side lights. This headlight is not too bad to change. Headlight on the other side over in the corner there, that's a real bugger, and you need to make a special tool in order to get that one out. And if you haven't got standard bulbs like I have, and you've got these high spec xenon ones, apparently you have to take the whole bumper off and the light cluster out. So that's a really good bit of design, Jaguar. I imagine people will really thank you for that. So just to finish up, on this side we've got the ECM, the electronic control module, the car's brain. We've then got the top of the shock absorber. These little clips here, presumably they're to fit something that's not fitted on it now. We'll move this way back. Then we've got the other main engine mount, which is just under there. It's always an irony to me to see that, you know, you've got here a 2.5 V6 engine. It's 196 brake horsepower, but although it's so sophisticated, nearly all this sophistication is about air quality. My old Scimitar, which was a 3 litre V6 Essex, actually had the same fuel consumption. It may not have had the same emissions, but it certainly had the same fuel consumption, and it had probably 50% less parts. So I suppose where you find something on the swings, you lose it on the roundabouts.